Good evening to you all. Yeah, before going, I would like to say some words about the living Earth. Actually, we are a sustainable and responsible tourism organization working for biodiversity conservation. Because we believe tourism is one of the most effective tools for conservation, where we can pull in actually the local communities into conservation activities. But unfortunately, that tool is not properly used. One of the reasons we believe is that it's because of the lack of awareness about the wonders around us. So, this when we planned a webinar like this, we thought we will introduce the world of biodiversity around us to you. Also, we will talk about the ecosystem service or the benefit what we derive from nature so that we will have a reason to protect them. And also we will discuss about the challenges, what we're gonna face, because when we are getting so much of benefit from the nature, we are basically responsible to protect them for future. So this series aims to empower the like-minded people from the best brains who are working in the field of conservation. So here we have a person who is having more than 40 years of experience as professor field biologist. He is also the founder of Eight Alliance and also the consultant of various foundations like Gorilla Foundation, Orangutan Foundation, Born Free Foundation. He is also instrumental in more than 100 documentaries, and at present, he is the United Nations Ambassador for Convention of Migratory Species. We are more than privileged to welcome Ian Redmond for inaugurating our webinar session. Thank you, Ian, for accepting your invitation. Yeah.
Thank you, Subish.
Thanks a lot.
Will you introduce the other panelists?
Yeah. I'm Ratish, I'm a clinical research professional and passionate about wildlife. So the past 7 years I was working with wildlife. I recently joined the Living Earth with Subish, and we want to make a change in the tourism sector. So we joined, and then this is our first webinar. Hope it will be fruitful to the tourism as well as to the wildlife people. Jis, you want to?
Hi everyone, I'm Jis Sebastian, and I'm currently a PhD scholar at Madurai Kamaraj University in Tamil Nadu. And I'm working on orchid ecology in the Western Ghats of Kerala. And right now I have submitted my thesis to the university, and currently more like self-employed, working in conservation biology and ecology. Yeah.
Subish, you want to introduce yourself?
She is well received.
Okay, myself Subish. So I completed my master's from Wildlife Institute of India, and I do believe in the potential of tourism for biodiversity conservation. Actually, we are looking India, we are a big country, but only we have 5% of total landscape under protected areas gathered. Remaining 95 is owned by the people. So without the active participation of the local community, we won't be able to conserve biodiversity outside protected areas. So we are working with local community to make conservation more active. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. So how do you go with the session? Shall we start with the experience of Ian Redmond with the mountain gorillas, and how did he started in Rwanda? He studied from, I think, Yale University, completed the degree from there, and then he reached Rwanda.
I got lucky.
So
let me jump in here, because thank you for your introduction, Subish, and very nice to meet all of you and to be part of this panel. And I think what unites the four of us on the screen and the dozens, if not hundreds, of people who are joining us remotely is, if you're joining this webinar, I think it's because you are a naturalist. By a naturalist, I mean someone who is just inherently fascinated by other life forms, plants, animals, and the way they all fit together. And that traditionally was known as natural history. Before that, natural philosophy. But these days, it's all the ologies, zoology and botany and I get called a primatologist, and sometimes, because I study elephants, an elephantologist. But I think what we're trying to do is to find an application for that in a desire to observe and interact with nature. And given that we're enjoying this webinar, thanks to extraordinary technology that allows me in Stroud in England to connect with friends and colleagues across India and in other parts of the world, you have to look at, well, what are the common themes? And when I was a student, as Subish mentioned, at Keele University in the 70s, I was, as I still am, interested in all life forms. But I got lucky because I organized talks for the Biology Society, which was a wonderful position to be in, because I could write to people whose scientific papers or articles I found interesting and say, would you like to come and talk? And they would come. They would come to the university, and you would meet them and talk to them and interact with them. And one such person was Sandy Harcourt, who had just finished a 2-year study of mountain gorillas, working with the then not very well known Dian Fossey. At that point, she hadn't got her PhD. She was an American scientist studying through an unusual route, because she'd been an occupational therapist in a children's hospital until she was in her mid-30s. But while she was doing that, she exercised her passion for natural history and desire to learn about the world, and went to Africa on just a personal safari. And while she was there, she met the paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey, and then later met him again when he was on a lecture tour in America, and said, you want someone to study gorillas? I am that someone. So Diane got her break by going up to a lecturer who she had previously met and saying, I'm the person you're looking for. And he took a chance on her, and that worked. 9 years later, that was in 1967 that Diane started. 9 years later, in 76, I came along. Through a similar process, I'd organized a lecture, spoke to a speaker, got a useful address, and written. And I wrote to Diane out of the blue. And she was living in a corrugated iron shack at 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters above sea level, in the forest where Rwanda meets what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, and the southwest corner of Uganda. And that mountain range is the Virunga volcanoes. And that is the best known habitat for mountain gorillas, although there is another habitat just a few miles to the north in Uganda called Bwindi. And the Bwindi Forest Reserve also has mountain gorillas, and is now open for visitors to go and see when it's not closed. I say when it's not closed because at the moment all ape viewing, indeed I think all primate viewing locations are temporarily closed because of the COVID-19 outbreak. And so just as we are confined to our homes and speaking through the internet, the things that I'm talking about that theoretically anyone can do, anyone can go to Rwanda or go to Uganda, go to the DRC and buy a gorilla viewing permit and go and meet gorillas in the wild. And the gorillas, because they are used to humans being friendly, will not run away. They will just carry on with their daily lives. And you can have the extraordinary experience of sitting. The regulation, it used to be 7 meters, now we're recommending increasing that to 10 meters away and observing them. So that potential exists. But right now, in the middle of this global pandemic, a lot of things that we have considered as normal are being reassessed through the lens of public health and epidemiology, and what are the possible risks and consequences. So we're in an extraordinary time. Going back 40-something years to my first encounter with the gorillas, it was idyllic in many ways, although my first day in the field was not what I expected. So I got to Rwanda because Diane had written back. I sent her this letter. This is a handwritten letter, but sent by airmail, And I didn't know it at the time, but when it arrives at the nearby town's post office, a porter would go along twice a week and pick up the post and put it and other supplies on his head. And with a long line of porters march up through the forest to the research centre, which then was in the forest. So my handwritten letter from a university student accommodation in Kiel in Staffordshire in England was flown to Rwanda, was picked up by the porter, carried up on his head and put onto Diane's desk. And sometime later she got around to reading it, and sometime later she got around to replying to it. So it was months after I'd written. And I thought it was like every other letter that, as an undergraduate, hopeful to find some useful employment I'd written, was just going to be ignored, or you'd never hear anything else. But that summer, after I had left the university, I got a letter from Diane, which essentially said, if you can get here, we'll try you.
Okay.
That's fantastic. I'm a newly graduated student with no money. How do I get to Central Africa? Luckily, my dad was in the army, and I was in the Territorial Army, which is a volunteer part-time in the medical corps, I should hasten to add. I'm not interested in killing people, but I don't mind helping them if they need medical help. And we managed to wangle a seat on an RAF plane going to Mombasa for the sum of £9. So it cost me £9 to get from England to Mombasa. I think that just about paid for the meals on the plane. So I arrived courtesy of the RAF in Mombasa, and then try and hitchhike, literally standing on the side of the road, trying to get a lift to Rwanda, which was 3 countries away. I got to cross Kenya, got to cross Uganda, get to Rwanda, and I didn't get a lift. So I got a train to Nairobi and waited in Nairobi, but there had been a coup in Burundi and all the flights were grounded. So this again was a portent of things to come. Political instability is sadly reality in the Great Lakes region of Africa. But when I eventually got to Karisoki and introduced myself to Diane, and she had written in her, I only got 2 letters before I got there, and the second letter she said, as you pass through town, pick up any post at the post office, because we only get 2 deliveries a week, and any extra deliveries are very welcome. So I went to the post office and found in the letters for the research centre the telegram I'd sent from Nairobi telling Diane when I was arriving. So I delivered my own telegram to say I'm arriving on this day. And having made the introductions, Diane said that I should go out the next day with the research assistant that I was replacing to find the gorillas. So the next morning, we set off. Tim White, an American traveller who was helping out at camp, who I was replacing, and a tracker, Nemeye, and me, just 3 of us. We set off, and in searching for the gorillas, we came across footprints. Now, gorillas have a rounded heel, rather like a human heel, quite different from the more angular heel of a chimpanzee, and we're too high in the mountains for there to be chimpanzees there. So when you see a heel print, it's either a gorilla or a human. And eventually we found some tracks where you could see the whole foot. And instead of having a big toe opposing the other 4 toes, like a gorilla's foot, it was in line. So it was clearly a human foot. So we'd come across some poacher trail. And Tim explained to me that the system at Karisoki was, if you find sign of poachers, you follow it. So we followed the tracks, and eventually high on Mount Karisimbi at about 11,500 feet above sea level, so higher than I'd ever been before in my life, on my first day in the field, we see poachers in the distance. We follow them, and we see them, they've made a little fire, so there's a bit of smoke coming up through the trees, and Tim and Rolakana and I gather around the bushes near the campfire, and it's explained to me that what we do is we charge. Okay, first day in the field, just arrived, and I'm at 11,500 feet above sea level, being told, right, we're going to charge this camp of poachers, the 3 of us. So, I took out of my bag my Cornwall Constabulary police whistle, because that has an official ring to it, you know. And we ran at the camp. The poachers took one look at us and fled, because although this was years after independence, the presence of a white skin still sort of denoted authority. And they knew that they were breaking the law. They were in Africa's first national park. It's been a national park since their great-grandfather's time. So they know that it's illegal to be poaching in the park, setting snares to catch antelope. So they fled. We grabbed their spears and traps and a butchered bushbuck, an antelope that they'd already killed and cut up and wrapped in its own skin. And before they turned around and noticed that there were only 3 of us and more of them, we legged it and went back down to the research centre. So I mentioned this story at some length because this was my first day in the field, and instead of studying gorillas, I ended up chasing poachers and confiscating their kit. Now, in their minds, I'm sure that their view of this was, my grandfather hunted in these forests, my father hunted in these forests, why shouldn't I, just because some white colonialists come and tell me it's a national park? And when they saw us and we took all their equipment, in their eyes, I'm sure they were thinking, they've stolen our kit.
Yes.
It's going to take a lot of time and effort for us to find the money and the metal to make a new spear, to craft new weapons, so that we can continue what we consider to be our right to do. And that was day 1 in the field. Day 2, which is what you asked me about, was when I first met the gorillas. That was fantastic. Because gorillas, although they're so big and impressive and muscular and powerful, and how can you, people, when you say gorilla, they tend to think of the silverback, who is the adult male. Now, when a male gorilla reaches puberty, what happens is kind of the reverse of what happens with humans. With humans, when a boy starts to become a man, he starts to sprout hair on his chest and on his chin. Whereas with gorillas, they've already got the hair on the chin, and they lose the hair on the chest. So male gorillas have bare chest, which means that when they stand up and beat their chest with a slightly cupped hand, not with a fist like in the Tarzan movies, they beat their chest with an open hand, it produces a pop sound, because they're hitting the chest just below the bulge of the pectoral muscle. There's a kind of a hollow. And that produces, I have to take my shirt off to do it properly, that produces a pock chest beat, which is the sound of a mature male. And in the way that frogs boom and call, and the strength of the call denotes the strength of the frog. So a female will hop towards the biggest call. So a silverback standing up and beating his chest, if he's got a good, powerful pock chest beat, clearly, audibly, he's a strong guy. So you come into a family of gorillas, and the first group I saw was group 4. The first gorilla I saw was an infant called Titus, who was being chased up a tree by his younger brother Quayle, and he appeared above the thicket. So my first gorilla was an infant being chased by a younger infant up a tree. And Tim said, right, Royal Carnival will stay here, the tracker. We'll go under the bushes and join the gorillas in the clearing. In those days, there was no 7-meter or 10-meter rule, because there wasn't really considered to be a big health risk. The scientists were up in sort of permanent quarantine, basically, living on their own in the mountains. And when they got to the gorillas, the aim was to get to a position where you could watch what was going on. And that might be at 10 meters away, it might be at 2 meters away, depends how thick the vegetation is. So he crawled under the thicket and emerged in this little glade. And there's a silverback here, there's his Uncle Bert, there's females dotted around, the kids playing. And the feeling was like joining a family picnic, when most of the adults have finished eating and they're just relaxing and snoozing in the sun or grooming each other. And the kids are playing because they've got lots of energy and they're climbing trees and chasing. And my job on that first contact was to make a sketch of the shape of the nostrils and the folds of skin above the nostrils, which is different in each gorilla. It's referred to as the nose print, because like a fingerprint, it's characteristic of each individual. Unlike a fingerprint, you can't go up with a bit of ink and a piece of paper and get an impression of the gorilla's face. They would object to that. So you sit there with your binoculars, or just, if it's close enough, with your eyes, sketching the shape of the nostrils and the folds, and trying to learn, the names of the different gorillas in the group. because if you're taking behavioral observations, you need to know who's sitting next to whom, who's grooming who, and what the sort of the dynamics of the group are. So that was my first 2 days in the field. Day one, conservation, day two, research. And I've been trying to balance those two imperatives ever since. But about a year and a quarter later, on the last day of 1977, one of our study animals, a young silverback called Digit, so called because one of his fingers was at a funny angle. And in fact, the picture that you can see over my shoulder is a painting of Digit by an English artist called Frank Lomas. And Digit was killed when he was still a young silverback on the last day of 1977. He was speared to death by a gang of poachers who were out setting snares for antelope. But it turned out, we found later, that they had a standing order from a guy in town who would give them $20 for a gorilla head and hands. And that wasn't for some local use. It was because foreigners would buy gorilla skulls and gorilla hands. So there are some traditional African uses for bits of dead gorilla. And in some parts of Africa, gorilla meat is a very special meat for very important men and their guests. But in Rwanda, nobody eats gorilla. And occasionally bits of gorilla are in demand for magic potions to make spells. But in this instance, Digit was killed so that a trader could make money. And he would pay $20 and sell the skull and hands for many times that to some foreigner who was coming into the country. So that was a real turning point in our lives, Diane and myself. I'd known Digit at that point for a little over a year. Diane had watched him grow up from infancy, and was sort of proud to see him developing into a fine young silverback. So it affected us both very powerfully, but it was also a milestone in gorilla conservation.
Okay.
Because the night after I found Digit's body, which wasn't the next day, it was the day after that, Diane and I sat up all night talking what to do next. And I said we must tell the world because Digit's death must not go unnoticed. Digit had already appeared on a poster that the Rwandan Parks Department had produced saying, "Come to meet him in Rwanda." So how ironic that their poster boy, the gorilla on their tourism poster, had been killed by poachers who were just poor farmers getting a bit of extra cash by going in the forest and setting snares for antelope. The snares can catch young gorillas and they can die or lose their hands. Now there's a team of vets called the Gorilla Doctors. You should follow them on Twitter and Facebook that monitor the health of the gorillas and remove snares. They can intervene and save the lives of babies that get caught in snares. But in those days, there was no veterinary help. So cutting the snares before the gorillas got to them was really important. And the day that I found Digit's body, we were following a line of poacher tracks, destroying snares so that the gorillas wouldn't get caught. And what we didn't know was after so many snares, we came across an area where obviously there'd been a fight, lots of flattened vegetation. There was a dead dog over here and there was a dead gorilla over here. And I went to see who it was and turned it over, but instead of a face, there was just a socket because his head had been cut off. And I said, well, it's a young silverback. It looks like it would be Digit. So I picked up his arm to see if he had the twisted finger. No hand, cut off at the wrist. So that was a really shocking day. It shocked me, and that was at that point probably the worst thing that had ever happened to me in my then short life. The next worst thing was an hour or so later when I had to find Diane and say, Diane, Digit's been killed by poachers. And Diane's first thought was, is anybody else hurt in the group? Did you follow them? No, I hadn't even thought of that. So she sent me off to find the rest of Group 4, and I tracked them with I'm trying to remember if it was Neme that day or Rualakana, but with the tracker. And when we found the group, we didn't find any more gorillas injured. That was good news. But in fleeing from the poachers, they'd run into another group with what you might call a hostile male who was still building his family. And so they were interacting just at the time when what they didn't need was an interaction with a male who's interested in acquiring females from Uncle Bert, and he just lost his second in command. that Digit as a young silverback might have played a part in defending the group from other males. Anyway, in all that confusion, the outcome of it was that Diane did tell the world about Digit's death. She worried that if the authorities in Rwanda saw a huge influx of money and resources to help protect gorillas following one dead gorilla, it would be quite easy to arrange for more dead gorillas. And she really worried that the second attack that happened 6 months later, that killed Uncle Bert and Macho and that wounded Quayle through the shoulder, he subsequently died of that wound 3 months later, that attack was actually ordered from someone on high to tell the world how much these gorillas were endangered. It's possible. We have no definite proof, but it did coincide with the visit of some journalists and high important conservation officials who arrived to find that there'd been another attack. So that was the beginning of what became the Mountain Gorilla Project that eventually evolved into the International Gorilla Conservation Program, IGCP, and then further developed the Greater Virunga Transboundary Initiative, which is a treaty between the three countries. So what began at ground level between rangers and the neighbouring countries is now an accord between the governments of the three countries. And at the same time that conservation organisations banded together to form that coalition, Diane set up what she initially called the Digit Fund, which after her death in 1985 became the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. And in America it still is the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund International, and that continues the research work that Diane started. And in the UK it became the Gorilla Organisation that I chair. So they have two different sort of outcomes of this one milestone event. But the good news, sort of fast forwarding 40 years, is that out of that turbulent time, gorilla tourism was developed by Bill Weber and Amy Vedder, who applied the methods of Karisoki for getting gorillas used to friendly humans. And that came at the same time as an improvement in the protection for those gorillas and a sharing of the revenues from the tourism that grew out of it with the communities around the park. And what you have today is an internationally acclaimed example of how carefully regulated and controlled ecotourism can not only save an endangered species and its habitat, but also improve the lives of the communities around the park. And I'm very proud of one of the gorilla organization's projects in Uganda, because we were asked by the Uganda Wildlife Authority to help convert poachers into farmers. And for that project to work, the poachers had to stand up in their community and say, I promise not to go into the park and set snares or hunt animals with spears or bows and arrows again. They handed over their kit and they said, I am an ex-poacher. And because they needed a way to earn a living, the gorilla organization hired an agronomist who taught them the methods of organic farming and gave them seeds and a goat and initially hired some land so that they could farm. And it has been a great success. They are respected members of their community. They're earning a lot more than they ever earned by killing animals in the park. They don't end up in prison when they get caught. And the most important thing is they're teaching their sons the methods, and I hope their daughters, the methods of organic farming. So isn't that exciting? You've gone from a problem and suddenly you have a solution. And the final sort of twist to that is that when tourism is operating normally, the lodges in which the tourists stay buy the vegetables. So the poachers are actually getting derived benefits from the tourism, in addition to the revenue sharing that the government organises, where a proportion of the income from gorilla viewing permits and in other parks chimpanzee viewing permits go into a community fund, where if the community wants a new corn mill or a new water tank or a new clinic, whatever they need, they get to spend the gorilla money or the chimp money on that benefit for the whole community. So that's a sort of a very rapid encapsulation, and I haven't shown any pictures yet. So I said I would share some screens. During this COVID-19 pandemic, while people have been locked up in their homes, I decided just before we were put into lockdown in the UK that to brighten people's day, I would share a short video. And it's I have a YouTube channel that I started in 2009, so just over 10 years ago, when I was asked to be the ambassador for the United Nations Year of the Gorilla. So it has a rather strange name of YOG Ambassador, Y-O-G, Year of Gorilla Ambassador. But of course, when you type Y-O-G-A for ambassador in YouTube, you get a lot of yoga videos. Persevere, go past the yoga to the YOG Ambassador and you'll find. And my most viewed video is a thing called Gorilla Mums. So the quickest way to find my YouTube channel is to type Gorilla Mums. And it's up at about 10.5 million views, which is great. And a lot of those views, I think over half of them are in India. So literally millions of people living in India have watched Gorilla Mums and have learned something about gorilla behavior. But the sad part about it is when you look at the statistics, it's a 2.5 minute video and the average viewing time is 1 minute 15 seconds. Well, come on, you can't stay the other minute. You miss all sorts of interesting bits of behavior in the second minute. So anyway, I thought, okay, if 1 minute, 1.5 minutes is the limit of people's attention span, those are the videos. So every day since just before lockdown, today was going to be the 85th daily Brighten Your Day video. And I'm going to show you some of those because some of them are relevant to what we're talking about. Let's go into this one because you're with a family of gorillas and with a group of tourists. And when we started this contact, we were the regulations 7 meters away from the gorillas, under a thicket. You can see kids are climbing in the bamboo, and there's just a bit of activity down here. Someone's doing something, grooming together. So this is ideal. You're at the right distance from the gorillas. The gorillas are clear, and then suddenly the silverback comes through and stands in a strut, and he's telling everyone that he is the boss. And just to reinforce that, instead of walking up the way that you might expect away from the tourists, you just caught a glimpse of one of the tourists there. They're coming towards us. The kids are playing, and the silverback sees the kids and thinks, right, I'm going between the kids and the tourists. So for this group of tourists, suddenly there is a silverback not 7 meters away, but walking within 1 meter of them. Now that is against the rules, but you can't explain the rules to the gorilla. And then the kids follow. And you can hear me saying, move back. We've got to just pull back a little bit. And they're saying, what? But we're right next to the gorillas. No, come on, move back. So we back off a little bit, and the gorillas have moved away a little bit, and that's good. But as soon as you're a few meters away, there is vegetation in the way, and it's very hard for people to take the photographs that are so important to them because they've paid a lot of money for the privilege of spending an hour near a family of gorillas. But for them, it was a very exciting day. And it's a sort of day which, you know, out of all the pictures they took that day, it's the one where the kiddie chest beats and does what his dad did, walks by the tourists. And again, we're saying, move back, move back. The guide and I are trying to pull people back.
Hear from you about David Attenborough experience in 1978, where he played with the gorillas. That was a sensation, right? That time.
Okay. The situation was not that dissimilar from that which you saw with the tourists, even though it was 30-something years later when that tourist encounter was filmed. But at that point, the gorillas were not used to large groups of tame humans. They were used to a researcher, sometimes with a colleague. But having a group, there was the team that you saw on the sofa there, John Sparks, the producer, Martin Saunders, the cameraman, sadly no longer with us, Dickie Bird, the sound man, and David as the presenter, and me. So that's 5 people, and the gorillas hadn't seen that many humans before, and seldom saw that much interesting stuff. So young gorillas are very curious, and all these cameras and tripods and things. But what you can't do with a family of gorillas is to stand with a boom microphone over the top of them, out of shot, but picking up the sound. So my job as a helpful assistant roped in to help the BBC was to get the microphone as close to David Attenborough as possible so that his carefully modulated tones There is more meaning and mutual understanding in exchanging a glance with the gorilla than any other animal I know. Profound words coming out of the mouths of then just David, now Sir David, was being captured by the microphone. Now, when you're filming on a separate tape recorder to get the sound and camera to film, this was film, of course, long before video, then you need a clapperboard. You've seen in the old movies where somebody goes clack with a black and white striped board, and that's so that you can make the sound fit the pictures. You need to synchronize the sound. And the point where the clap does that is the point on the soundtrack where you hear the noise. And after that, the lips are moving in time to the sound. Whereas if you don't have that, you have that disorientating, what we're seeing a lot now on some of these Zoom calls. I hope people watching this are hearing me and seeing my lips move at roughly the same time. But instead of having a clapperboard, again, you're sitting with a family of gorillas. You can't frighten them by going clack. So my job was to tap the microphone in an obvious way so that when I did that, they had the sound on the tape recorder and could see which frame of the film, this is 16mm film, is where my fingers hit the microphone. So that was the filming of that, and that went on for several days, out each day. And only on one day did Diane go out. She was ill at the time, coughing blood and very unwell. But she took out the BBC crew one day, and that was the day that Pablo, a young juvenile male, sat on David Attenborough. And that was the moment that was not intended. David was trying to find a moment to talk about the importance of an opposable thumb, and he was part of playtime for the young gorillas. And because they were filming on 16mm film, they have a limited amount of film. It's not like today where you can just keep going and you've got a hard drive and you can or more cards. You've got lots of filming time. Then every foot had to count. And at the point where David was ready to speak, before filming the important piece to camera that he was going to do about the opposable thumb, John Sparks said to Martin Saunders, the cameraman, check the gate, which is the gate where the film passes in front of the lens. And if there's a hair stuck in there, flickering, it makes the film useless. So he said, check the gate, make sure there's no fluff or messing. And while Martin had the lens off with a puffer blowing, that was the point where Puck, the female gorilla sitting behind David, leaned over and took his head and pulled it back and looked into his face from inches away. That was not filmed. And while Martin is checking the gate and putting the lens back on, the presenter is having his head examined by a very large looking gorilla, and the producer's thinking, we haven't finished the series yet. What do we do if the gorilla pulls the head off the presenter? But Puck was very good. She put his head back and he then did his piece to camera. But anyway, it was a memorable sequence, and many people rate it as one of their favorite moments on television, not just natural history television. And we reminisced about that 4 years ago when David had his 90th birthday. He produced a program to celebrate it and kindly invited me onto the sofa to reminisce about that. And David is still going strong at 94, producing world-changing documentaries, which is what he's very good at doing. So that's to answer your question about the famous gorilla sequence in Life on Earth.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I do
you.
have another question. Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, Subish.
Yeah. So I wish to know what is the impact of COVID on tourism, because you told us that how tourism is playing an important role in gorilla conservation. And after the COVID issue started, we came to know that the funding purpose for conservation has been rediverted to so many other things. So what will be the impact of COVID on conservation? What do you think?
Well, those are very important questions at this moment. And in fact, on Earth Day this year, the Ape Alliance, which is this coalition of organizations that I chair, held a panel discussion to go into great detail. So anyone who's got 2 or 3 hours to spare, they can hear a panel of experts discussing this. But let me summarize. there is the direct impact. The SARS-CoV-2 virus affects humans, and we're very familiar now with the symptoms and sadly, often the tragic consequences of that infection. To our knowledge, no great ape other than humans has yet been infected by that new form of coronavirus. But we know that their physiology is so like ours. They are our closest cousins in the animal kingdom. They share between 98 and 99% of their DNA with us. So with gorillas, depending on which study you look at, it's about 98 and a bit percent the same DNA. They have the same receptor cells in their throat and lungs. So if the virus got into them, they would develop a disease. We do not know how deadly that disease would be, but we do know that other human viruses that have got into ape populations have sometimes killed them. The thing is, if you're a free-living animal, the virus doesn't have to kill you directly. It can just make you feel so bad that you fall prey to a predator, or you can't feed properly and your condition deteriorates, and there isn't the kind of the health service that humans have developed to support a member of our family or community who is ill. So even if the virus doesn't kill a wild animal, the consequences of being unwell might kill that animal. And we just don't want to find out whether that is the case with endangered species of great ape. And that's why all ape tourism has been suspended for the moment. And that's to protect the apes. But you're quite right. The indirect consequences of that protection are that tourists are not coming and spending money. They're not staying in local hotels. They're not eating the local vegetables, whether they're grown by the poachers or farmers who have already had always been legal. And there are so many jobs that depend on tourism around the mountain gorilla habitat, and now many other ape populations that have been benefiting from international travel, bringing tourists to visit them. And at the same time that source of revenue has reduced, the charities that appeal to caring individuals in the developed world mostly, but also around the world, if you have some spare money and you want to help conserve gorillas or chimpanzees or orangutans or bonobos or gibbons, those donation streams have been reduced because in many countries people are not working, they're having a reduced income, they don't have the spare money to give to conservation. So we've got a reduction in charitable donations, a reduction in income from ecotourism, and the potential, given that the communities around the park are facing real hardship. In many developing countries, they're more afraid of starvation than they are of COVID, because that'll get them first. If they have no money and they can't work to get money because they're supposed to stay in their house and they don't have enough resources to buy food, then they're going to go hungry. And when people are hungry and they're next to a natural habitat with antelope wandering around, what's the temptation? Of course, it's going to be to go and set snares. Now, with mountain gorillas, that temptation is not to kill gorillas, but it might be to set snares, and that can indirectly affect gorillas. Although, again, with the veterinary support, gorillas who are caught in snares can have the snare removed, and their life is usually saved if they're in one of the tourist groups or the research groups. If they're in a wild group that still flees from people, you don't know they're in a snare. You can't get near enough to them to dart them and remove the snare. So there, the mortality from snares remains as high as it ever was. But in the groups that are protected for tourism and research, you can intervene and save their lives, which is a good thing, as long as there are resources to do that. But you need to pay the vets, you need to pay the trackers, you need to pay all these people. And if there isn't tourism and there isn't charitable donations to meet those demands, where's the money going to come from? At the moment, I think everyone's coping, but everyone's asking, well, how long before we can come out of lockdown and resume tourism? Then the protections you put in to prevent apes from getting the virus are how are you going to stop the virus from getting through to them? The scary thing about the COVID-19 virus is that it can persist for a period of time out of the body. So you don't just have to cough at a gorilla close enough for droplet infection. If you cough onto a bamboo stem, which is a shiny surface, and we're told that on hard surfaces the virus can stay viable for a day or two or maybe even 3. We don't know that. And so it may be that just a tourist who doesn't know he's got the virus, he feels fine, but he or she might be shedding it. They're going up to the high altitude for the first time in their life. So and you've probably seen the studies where when someone is exercising, it's like a plume of droplets following them as they run along. And those droplets are laden with the virus. Now put that in that image in your mind with a group of tourists puffing and panting to get up to see the gorillas, and they're breathing heavily and perhaps expelling virus which lands on surfaces which might persist for a day or two, and unknown to anyone, young gorillas come next day and climb that tree and catch the virus, and it spreads through the group very quickly. If the silverback dies, the females will leave what's left of the group. They feel secure with an adult male leading them. And if the dominant male dies, if there's a second in command, he might step into that role, but he might not be impressive enough to keep the females. They might leave anyway. But whether they leave because they don't like the new guy, or whether they leave because there isn't a second in command, it's a small group, there's just one silverback, 2 or 3 females, some kids. If he dies, then they will join other groups, and then the virus would travel to those groups. We don't know what the mortality would be, but because of this whole question of it isn't the virus that kills the gorillas, perhaps it's just the consequences of feeling ill. There aren't many predators left in the mountain gorilla habitat, but traditionally in the past that they have been subject to predation by leopards. And a young gorilla could potentially be attacked by a large snake or a large bird of prey, but it's unlikely if everyone is well. But if the mother's feeding rubbish and the kid's climbing and isn't being watched, then it's just possible that a crowned eagle could take a young gorilla. Probably not a mountain gorilla because they're not that high up in the mountains. But there are risks. And so if tourism resumes, when it resumes, I think the awareness of the importance of wearing a mask will be much higher. Some sites you have to wear masks to see apes, some sites they don't insist on it. I think everyone's going to insist on it now. But mask protocol must be observed, because once you've breathed through a mask for an hour, then that mask itself is a great danger. And if you drop it, or even if you drop it and pick it up, potentially you're leaving a little pool of virus on the vegetation which a gorilla might walk over. So there's going to have to be very strict protocols. And whereas 7 meters was the intended distance, but as you saw in that little video, sometimes the gorillas come close to the tourists and there isn't time to back away. 10 meters at least is going to be the distance. So the opportunity, you're managing the risk. Yes, the revenues from gorilla tourism is important for the conservation and for the community benefits, and just generally raising the standard of living of people who live around those locations so that they're not tempted into poaching or illegal activities, cutting the wood to make charcoal, killing other animals in the forest that might put the gorillas at risk and those animals at risk. You want to keep the good work of the past 40 years going without introducing this potentially deadly threat of a new virus. So that's in summary what the COVID-19 has done for us. And some of my Brighten Your Day videos illustrate that very well. Yesterday's was of visitors to the sacred monkey forest in Bali, where long-tailed macaques are traditionally fed, and people like to have their photographs taken with a completely wild macaque sitting on their shoulder, eating peanuts off their head or whatever. And it was, yeah, every day people would get nips from monkeys who felt that they weren't treating them with appropriate respect. Not everyone has a good sense of monkey etiquette. Just as when you visit the gorillas, you have to introduce people to gorilla etiquette, the do's and the don'ts, so that the visit goes well. All those activities where humans and wild animals come close together need to be re-examined not just from the animal welfare and from the conservation point of view, but from the public health point of view. And I think we're going to see some serious changes in the way that temples interact with monkeys. Now, in India, you tell me, you know, I'm sure temples near you where people habitually feed macaques or langurs, and there is often close quarters contact. We now have to start thinking, ooh, what if the person who's giving the food to the monkeys is unknowingly shedding the virus? If it gets into the monkey population, and all the old world monkeys seem to have the same receptors that make them susceptible to COVID-19, what happens if they get sick? They will potentially spread the disease among the monkey population. And if it's in somewhere like Periyar, we had this conversation, Subish, when I first met Subish earlier this year. It was on a visit to Periyar, and I watched monkeys. It's one of the Brighten Your Day videos. You can find a monkey who's stolen an ice cream. And people are very tolerant of that. You're not supposed to feed the monkeys, but if a monkey swipes your ice cream, everybody gathers around to take pictures of the monkey eating the ice cream. But if the person who lost their ice cream happened to have the virus, that monkey gets it. And in that case, it was one of the macaques. And if the macaque is then feeling really ill and can't flee from a predator and gets eaten, if it's by a tiger, we know from the case in the New York Zoo that tigers can test positive for COVID-19. And again, it doesn't have to kill the tiger, but if the tiger is just feeling ill and can't quite get the energy to catch prey, then it will die of that. So the potential for this disease to get into an ecosystem is what terrifies me. And I hope that all the necessary authorities that manage those interactions between humans and non-human primates and other species are now reassessing how, if they're to continue, they have to be changed and managed differently to avoid that frightening consequence of the virus jumping species again.
Ian, actually, the session is going really interesting, and now it's already 8 o'clock. So, but we have more questions for you to know more about the rituals, ecotourism, and all these things. But I think we can give this, opportunity for the attendees to interact with you because they are here. So sometimes they will be having some questions for you. So, Ritesh?
Yeah, we in chat only you and Jesus mentioned questions.
So, wish to know whether anyone of you are interested in interacting with Ian. Do you have any questions or something?
Subish,
I see a question in the Q&A box saying what kind of disease
causing factors? Yeah.
Well, at the moment with COVID-19, it is this novel coronavirus, but potentially it could be a bacterium, it could be a protozoan. If you've got amoebic dysentery, that could potentially infect other species, and it could be a helminth, could be a parasitic worm. So the various agents or pathogens that can cause disease, if you're dealing with a species that are closely related, it's possible that one that evolved to parasitize or infect one host could jump to a different host. But most parasites and most pathogens are fairly host specific. And if they've evolved in a host, the chances are they won't have a lethal consequence in that host. It's when they jump into a closely related host and they don't quite get it right. They end up in the wrong tissues. They end up doing something which is lethal to the host, that things go wrong. And that's the case with many tropical diseases that humans suffer from. We happen to get infected by some other species parasite that doesn't that our immune systems can't deal with. And I guess with the coronavirus, this is what the most widely accepted explanation of how it came into humans is that there are many kinds of coronavirus that live in bats, especially horseshoe bats, little insectivorous bats. And when humans and those bats interact, if you've got bats in your house, you're very unlikely to get it. But somehow it jumped into another species, possibly a small carnivore. And with the novel coronavirus, there is a theory that it might be the pangolin, an ant-eating mammal, that was the intermediate host. And then it jumped again. And how can a virus, where can a virus get from a bat to a pangolin or some other carnivore to humans. Well, sadly, the place where that seems to have happened is a meat market in Wuhan in China, where animals of many species are brought from all over the world and are slaughtered there. And most of the time that people have been objecting to that practice, it has been out of concern for the conservation of the species involved or the welfare of the animals that are having a horrible time being kept in a cage and then being killed in not necessarily a very humane way. And suddenly there's a whole new consideration for that, which is the public health implications of mixing bodily fluids of different species. And people have been predicting, scientists have been predicting for years that there would be another virus, the same as SARS or MERS, from this kind of behavior. And China has now closed these markets and has just announced that pangolin scales can no longer be prescribed by traditional Chinese medicine practitioners. And the hope is that that will stop these extraordinary shipments of tons of pangolin scales. And you think how big a pangolin is, right? This sort of size, if it's a giant pangolin in Africa, a bit bigger, you need a lot of pangolins killed to strip the scales off and put them in a bag and make a ton shipment. So countless thousands of these harmless, fascinating ant-eating mammals have been killed to supply that trade. And one hopes that it doesn't just go underground and become part of the black market trade, illegal, difficult to detect, because it is wiping out populations of pangolins, and it's posing a risk of another pandemic, a virus we haven't heard of yet, just as this one. You know, a few months ago, none of us had heard of this disease. No one had studied it, and we didn't know what its consequences would be. And it's been so serious that it's literally ground our economy to a halt. And everyone's thinking, well, how can we build our economy back? And it's so important that that building back is done better with more respect for nature, less destruction of natural ecosystems, and better conservation of those habitats which provide us with ecosystem services. They purify our air and our water and store the carbon that we puke out in our machines and aircraft. And at the same time, they are a source of wonder for anyone who's lucky enough to visit them. And that leads to that big dilemma. If your conservation is based on tourism that requires international travel, wait a minute, we're asking people not to fly to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but we're constructing conservation around the premise that people will come from all over the world to visit your wonderful habitat. And whether it's a forest or a desert or a grassland in India or in Africa or any other part of the world, if it involves international travel, you have to balance the benefit to conservation and ecosystem services against the cost of the carbon emissions. And when I say the cost, I don't mean the immediate financial cost of the ticket. I'm talking about the uncounted ecological cost that so far does not feature in any of the world's economies. You talk to an economist about all these natural processes and they say, oh, those are externalities. They're not part of our economic model. Then your economic model is built on imagination because they are the biological reality in which we all live. So we have to build back better, taking into account the real biological constraints that living on this planet should impose on us, and in the past has imposed on us by means of not being that many people having a lot of ecosystems. And now that there are 7.35 and rising billion people, all of whom want a better standard of living and probably would like to fly around the world, oh, wait a minute, maybe we have to think better. So you mentioned virtual travel, and it's something that I've been involved in with you can visit a website called vicotourism.org, V for virtual, ecotourism.org. And there you can take a few sample safaris, but we haven't got that far with it. And now there are even more impressive systems where you're literally in the middle of a 360 video watching animals all around you. And those are wonderful, but at the moment, no one is monetizing them so that they actually help to cover the cost of conserving that habitat. But that needs to, I think, be part of our thinking. But I started off observing that we four and probably the however many hundred are watching are doing this because we're naturalists. And if you're a naturalist, you use all your senses, not just sight and sound. Virtual travel tricks your brain into thinking you're there, and you can enjoy the sights and the sounds, but not yet the smells or the touch of the earth or the forest or the animals. So what I tend to want to do at the end of any virtual trip is say to people, take that bloody virtual reality headset off and go outside and enjoy the real reality wherever you are in the world. And if you look through my Brighten Your Day videos, you'll see a slug crossing a road. You'll see a millipede with the metachronal rhythms of the legs, which are wonderful to look at in close-up, as well as gorillas and elephants, because wherever you live in the world, there is nature. And by enjoying it, then you can get a benefit from it beyond the ecosystem services, just the aesthetic and spiritual uplift you get from being in nature. Let me answer Dr. Jayaprakash. Priority for constructing roads are on the increase, but at the cost of migratory routes, corridors. How to overcome this trouble? And this is a very good point. And in fact, it's related to tourism, because tourists, particularly from the developed world, don't want to be bouncing for hours in a vehicle to get to their destination. They want to glide along nice, smooth roads. And when you build nice, smooth roads, you're cutting through habitat, creating geographical barriers for the movement of some species, especially primates. Earlier today, I was on a UNESCO webinar, United Nations Environment, Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, where Dr. Sabrina Kreef, who studies chimpanzees in Kibale Forest in Uganda, showed a slide of a young female chimp, just 15, just sort of early in her life. Chimpanzees can live up to 40 or 50 years of age. And she'd been hit by a car. And the reason she'd been hit by a car is that for the past 2 or 3 months, there haven't been cars. So the road that goes through their forest, they'd started to use it more. And then the government released the lockdown, and drivers were not careful. And a speeding minibus killed a chimpanzee, which is terrible in a small population, a young female. That's a really important individual. So speed, we seem as a culture to be addicted to speed. We like to drive fast. And if the road is fenced or going through agriculture, not that many, well, even there, actually, you see roadkill on the side of the road. You see animals that are killed by speeding traffic. So ideally, we need to slow down. So if a new road is being put through habitat of any wildlife, ideally, the road builders will have talked to ecologists who know which species are using that habitat and will design species-appropriate constructions that allow that movement to continue. In the UK, they build little pipes under roads where toads that migrate can get through. Otherwise, volunteers with buckets have to come out when the toads are migrating to their pond and literally carry them across the road. And the consequences of not doing that is, a lot of dead toads, but a potential accident black spot because squashed toads are very slippery. Sounds horrible, but accidents can happen if there are lots of toads crossing a road and cars just plow through them. So putting up a barrier to stop the migration, the toads can't cross the barrier and they end up in a bucket, which you then carry across the road with volunteers, is one very laborious method, but far better when you're building the road to build just a tube going through. And that will do for small mammals as well as amphibians, but not for elephants. There you need significant investment of resources to build either an overpass or an underpass. There are examples that exist. I know of one in Kenya, and it took a while for the elephants to use it, but by dragging elephant dung through it, they were convinced that elephants had been through it, and now they just use it. So instead of elephants being hit by traffic, which is bad for the traffic because people die, vehicles are destroyed, and bad for the elephants because elephants die and are injured. Instead, yes, it costs money, but you prevent loss of life. And I think most people, when they see that, the prevention of accidents to humans and the prevention of accidents to elephants, it's worth doing. But for that to happen, ideally before the road is built, but if not, then after the road is built, someone has to say, we think this is important enough to spend this amount of public money on it, if it is a public works. If it's a private company, then their shareholders and their customers, whatever it is they're producing, need to be convinced that yes, it's worth spending some of the company's revenue to achieve that objective. And one of my video clips taken earlier this year in Kerala was of elephants in a tea plantation. And I know that the new roads that have been built around Munnar must be very scary for elephants. They're living in the landscape. And I saw dung on the road, and the chief warden showed me a video that she shot a couple of nights before of a big tusker in the headlights of vehicles, and people are terrified of encountering elephants in that situation. But the elephants that I watched myself were feeding in a tea plantation across a valley. There were no people around, and they weren't destroying the tea bushes, as you will probably all know. They were plucking the grasses from between the tea bushes. So effectively, they were doing the weeding. Yep. Helping the plantation owner by eating the unwanted plants from between the tea bushes so that more of the nutrients and rainfall could go into growing tea. I thought that was a wonderful example. I talk a lot about hashtag gardeners of the forest because of the role that elephants and primates play in seed dispersal and pruning forest trees and so on. But this was a gardener of the plantation. So there are examples where elephant-friendly tea is being produced, and it's now being marketed in the developed world as a reason for buying that particular brand of tea, yes. Because it's produced in a way that is ele-friendly. And I think those sorts of measures are possible. So thank you for the question. You're right, roads are a nightmare for migratory species that are terrestrial, and we need to take the necessary steps to protect those corridors, working with communities who might feel that their needs are not being taken into account. But in India, more than anywhere else in the world, I think people will be supportive of measures to help protect elephants and to help protect primates because of your cultural and religious affinity for Hanuman and Ganesh.
So the next question is from Divya. How do you develop ecotourism in such a way to avoid stresses to animals, especially in protected areas?
That is a good question. Thank you for that question. The term habituation is used in this context to mean scaring an animal so often without negative consequences that the animal or the group of animals decides it's not worth running away. So if your tourism depends on animals trusting you, and in the past they have not trusted humans because they've been hunted or chased and regarded humans as being dangerous and scary, how do you convince an animal that you're different? And if you succeed in that, how do you make sure that none of the previous humans with a different agenda who wanted to hunt or get something from that animal don't come and take advantage of the fact that you've won the trust of the animal? So with gorillas, gorilla tourism is most successful in East Africa, Rwanda and Uganda, and the eastern bit of DRC, where there isn't a tradition of eating gorillas. So the gorillas culturally, although they might be scared of humans, they're not so scared that you can't win their trust. And having won their trust, on the whole, with a few rather tragic exceptions, we've been able to protect those animals. So we didn't betray the trust that they've given to our species. In India, there are examples where wild animals have become accustomed to humans, mostly because the humans are giving them food. And that, to me, is a complication, because if the animal sees you as a source of food and you don't meet the animal's expectations, so you've got a bag, but you're not reaching into the bag and giving it food, but the last 10 people that animal saw did that, then it might try and help itself to the bag, whether or not you've got food in it, just because it thinks, there's a human, there's a bag, I want it. And that can lead to conflict. Just as if you clear some forest and plant some crops, and the animals that traditionally pass through that forest feeding suddenly find, all these new food plants. They will regard that as a bonus, but the farmer who's worked hard to plant the crops will be upset. So you really have to think about the interactions between people and other species. And if it's for tourism, design a method that allows the tourists to get what they want, which is usually photographs or observations. And with gorilla viewing, that can be done if you build a hide or a platform in a tree near where gorillas come. And in Central Africa, where the Western gorillas live, rather than the mountain gorillas, Western lowland gorillas come to big open areas created by elephants because they have mineral-rich soils. And the gorillas come and feed on the plants in the bais, these big open clearings. So that form of gorilla tourism involves sitting on a platform, probably with a drink in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other. It's my kind of natural history. And you watch the gorillas from a distance. And you're not getting close to them, you're not presenting a threat to them. And that's a much better model for a post-COVID ecotourism for gorillas. But with some species, like orangutans, they are largely arboreal, they move around a lot. It's very hard to get people to see them, unless, as in Kinabatangan, in Sabah, in Malaysian Borneo, your orangutan viewing is done from a boat. There, the orangutans nest in trees along the river in the evening. And so in the early morning, if you chug along the river, you can see orangutans getting up and starting to forage from your boat. You're not close enough to pose a threat. So that's a form of tourism which is, I think, COVID friendly, or I suppose COVID unfriendly, but it prevents the disease transmission. And we need to start thinking of how we can reshape all our human-wildlife interactions to reduce the risk. And I would say that means an end to the international trade in live animals from the wild, because they are stressed and frightened, their immune system will be depressed, and whatever viruses they might be shedding could be the next pandemic. Just don't do it, and provide alternative livelihoods for those who had a living doing that. And where tourism takes place, we need to design it so that the distance is such that if someone did unwittingly cough viruses, they wouldn't get onto the animal or onto the surfaces that the animal is going to touch. And that might mean not the close encounters that people have thought was the best part of visiting gorillas, but from a respectful and public health aware distance. So social distancing between humans and non-humans is, I think, probably the way to go.
Two more questions are there. So, do you come across any viral disease reports to gorillas during your field?
Yes, but in the days when I was doing field work at Karasaki, we didn't have the capacity to sample and identify viruses. We know from even the first Western observer to write detailed papers about gorilla biology was George Schaller. He observed they often had coughs and snuffles. These are mountain gorillas living at the upper limit of what a gorilla can cope with. And so he observed that and he was observing them from a distance, so there was no suggestion that he was the vector that brought viruses in, that they had upper respiratory tract infections. So that's not new. What is new is the new varieties of virus that tourists can bring in. And there have been some instances where both respiratory tract infections and also gut infections have been identified and tracked back to people. But we have to remember that humans and gorillas and chimpanzees have been sharing the same forest since we went on our separate evolutionary pathways. So humans in gorilla habitat is not new. And some species, like hookworms, their larvae go into the soil and they wait for a foot to walk on it, and then they bore up into the foot. So humans have probably been exchanging hookworm larvae for generations. It's not new. And the fact that most tourists are not barefoot means that that is not a likely factor. Whereas droplet infection in the past would have been very rare, because very seldom would a human get close enough to be able to cough on a gorilla. Certainly not with old viruses that can't live off the host. But you get a new virus that can survive for a day or two or three on a hard surface, then that new possibility exists. And we have to design our tourism and our conservation activities. It's no good tourists being kept to that sort of distance and wearing masks if the patrols that rangers are doing don't do that. So if you go into that forest, you have to be aware of the fact that you might be depositing a virus, and that means you have to take precautions. And in the UNESCO webinar this morning, we were being told how that was being done in Kibale. They dip their boots in disinfectant before they go into the forest. They have a separate uniform for forest work from working at home or around the park headquarters, so that they're minimizing the opportunity for a virus to hitch a ride on a human into the forest and potentially infect the chimpanzees. And of course, they are wearing masks and having a strict mask protocol. So you put the mask on when you're in the forest or near the gorillas, and you take it off and wash it in warm, soapy water while singing Happy Birthday twice, I expect. I don't know, what method do you use to make sure you wash your hands for the requisite time? You're not answering any of my questions. Okay.
I didn't hear that properly.
Hand wash.
How many seconds you mentioned?
So I have seen some disease symptoms, but haven't been in a position to identify them. I did study the parasites of gorillas, but I was mainly looking at the helminths, the parasitic worms. If you're really interested in this, I recommend you go to the Ape Alliance YouTube channel and watch the panel discussion, which will answer some of these questions with more detail from some of the scientists involved. And the next question is from Sagar Ranjan,
very interesting
which says that Chinese visitors have a knack for wildlife meat, plus they pay more, and wherever they go, they demand this kind of hospitality. And as long as the demand is there, wildlife will be hunted and used for food. What can be done regarding this? Well, I was hearing today that on Chinese social media, millions of people have been demanding change.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there might be some Chinese people who really like the taste of certain species that don't want to lose that pleasure. But at the same time, there are millions of Chinese people who are seeing what's happening with this pandemic, hearing the explanation and saying, okay, well, we don't want to do that. So I'm very wary of people who say the Chinese are doing this. Now, some Chinese people are ardent conservationists who are as passionate as we are about protecting wildlife. But the ones who don't have that knowledge or awareness and might have traditional or cultural influences that make them want to do things that we now think are inappropriate, we just need to work with them. And I don't think wagging a finger is the way to do that. I think the answer in conservation is usually enlightened self-interest. When someone realizes why it is in their own interest to do something, they will want to do it. You don't have to tell them to do it. So when you see the world's economy grinding to a halt because of something which might be a very rare occurrence, but is quite clear how and why it can happen, then you take precautions against that. And I think that the Chinese will be as keen to do that as anybody else, because they want to continue selling their goods to the world. They want their tourists who are wealthy enough to come and visit other parts of the world to travel, and likewise people from around the world to visit China. And if we're going to have that kind of interaction between countries and citizens of the world, it has to be done with a new public health awareness arising from COVID-19. And I think we're seeing this happening. But the other thing, of course, we have to bear in mind is that the climate change curve, we've been trying to flatten the curve of the COVID-19 pandemic. Behind that curve is the climate change and the biodiversity loss curve. So while we're focusing on COVID-19 in the short term, we have to change this rebuilding of our economy and our way of life needs to take into consideration the ecosystem services provided by the habitats that we have traditionally regarded as wasteland until they are converted into human use, and the species therein that we have to think of. They're not just something to take a picture with when you're on holiday, but they play a role in the ecology of that, and we destroy them at our peril. So by destroying those other species, it doesn't just risk extinction for them, it risks extinction, or certainly a very, very difficult life for humans. And I think the one thing that humans are very aware of is not wanting to have a very difficult life. And we've been experiencing that in the past 2 months. And I think this is as nothing compared to the potential difficulties that loss of biodiversity and dangerous climate change will bring to us and our communities. So I think I very much echo the sentiments of all those leaders of countries and corporations and NGOs who say we have to build back better with the necessary changes in our economy and society to take into account these overlapping and generally perceived as separate but actually connected threats that we face.
It's already 1.5 hours, so
what have we got? We've got in the chat box, we've got some
2 more questions are there, but
yes, Sarah Kumar has asked to all panelists, so I'm going to invite some of you to speak to this one. What changes will COVID-19 bring to the tourism sector, and whether it will affect tourism positively or negatively? So Subish, you're trying to set up an ecotourism project in Kerala. How would you answer that?
The change, what we are expecting is a move from crowded tourism. So more and more people will be shifting to experience-oriented tourism rather than just going to a crowded area and exploring things. So I think there is a boom for ecotourism, or the people who wish to do more sustainable and responsible tourism in future, more experience-oriented tourism from a safer side. And crowded tourism, I'm not expecting that much crowded tourism in the coming days. And the good thing is, more remote places will be coming into picture. Rather than going to a tourist place, people are now exploring new destinations. So definitely more local communities will be can be incorporated in future.
That's encouraging. Because the tourists who seek that uncrowded place, you hope, will have in mind that they are not going to leave their litter, they're not going to indulge in practices which are damaging to the habitat or to the communities that live there. But yes, if it's well managed, that could be a real benefit. I guess one of the drawbacks is that tends to make it expensive. So that kind of tourism is available for people with money, but not available for people without money, which is unfortunate because you want everyone to be able to experience this wonder.
Challenge, but still we are working with the homestays and other people. So hope we will be able to come out with some good solutions for this. And apart from that, we are also working on carbon neutral tourism because we want to make guests feel that they contributed something back to Earth. So we are encouraging homestays or properties which are carbon neutral in attempts that they are protecting more greenery as well as they are supporting in local biodiversity conservation. So definitely we will make them the unsung heroes of conservation because we can't do conservation. One man can never be a hero in all the places. So we are trying to give that role to the local communities itself by supporting them with the help of tourism. But they have to assure one thing, it should be carbon neutral. They should be planting more trees and more greenery, and they should also keep a watch of the biodiversity outside. So we are also working on a small application where they can record it. Even if they don't know the species name also, they can record, take a photo, they can upload the photo so that we will get details of what all species are available in their locality. So indirectly, they will be supporting us in the conservation. So most of the time, we are concentrating on the urban and rural economy because these areas are beyond the protection of forest department. So normally, the community should take the responsibility. Otherwise, nothing can be done in that places because it's not coming under the protection area.
Very good.
So Ritesh, bye. If no other questions, please, what of thanks because it's a long session. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar, and I think hopefully everyone heard about your experience, and we hope that they take something from this session. And someone mentioned about what are the qualities you want to grow up for a perfect conservationist. I think you are the perfect conservationist, and if they can follow your if they can follow your path, they can be a perfect conservationist. That's what I want to tell you.
But before you sign off,
yeah,
could I ask Jis about her study of orchids? Because there are some fascinating orchids in gorilla habitat. Very few people go there to see the orchids, they go to see the gorillas. But those who are interested in plants notice them. And do you find that people interested in plants come to where you were studying to see orchids? And if they do they leave them there and take photographs, or do they try and steal the orchids to grow them at home?
Not really. Actually, in India, like there are very few people who are kind of interested in plants, and I think like they are known as like flower hunters. They do it like with passion. But if you consider the tourist, you can say like tourism, with respect to plants, it's like almost non-existent in India. I mean, like maybe wildflowers is an exception where people go for seeing the valleys like with full of flowers, and that's an exemption. But in other case, like I have worked in different places like in forest areas and private plantations where I've seen like plants is like not a concern for the landowner or even for a tourist. So that's it's a different, I mean, it's a difficult thing. And so here, along with Living Earth, I think we are trying to bring up some new projects wherein we can implement some conservation activities for orchids, especially like epiphytic orchids that are orchids that grows on trees, and also the terrestrial orchids. So we do have like a lot of interesting orchids with potential for horticultural prospects, and so we can definitely think of different possibilities. And but at present, I mean, it doesn't exist. Yeah.
Well, if I ever get to your study area, I hope you'll show me some orchids.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Subish?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, may I add something? Like,
Sure.
hello.
Just please go.
Yeah. So adding to we have already discussed, I think the like what changes will COVID-19 brings to tourism sector and all that related to it. And I was just like wondering, like I really admire the work that you have done, like in the hills of mountain gorillas and all those areas. And also it's highly appreciable that where you have mentioned there were cases where poachers turned into like conservationists or farmers. So, but now, like if you consider like COVID-19 actually comes from habitat destruction or changes in climate, you can say. So, and this is becoming more real than ever. So, like there are more troubles are like approaching, I believe. So, like in this situation, like do you actually think these farmers will remain as farmers? Because I mean, the food security, that is going to be the biggest threat, I think, globally now, and the crop damage would be like more frequent. So it would be very difficult for a organic farmer in the tropical countries to survive. So is it actually possible to like keep them like happy with conservation of the flora and fauna around? And do you actually think like the future of ecotourism is looking good at this point of time?
what you outline is the challenge we face. We have to find the resources so that people who have changed their way of life don't revert back to the old, more damaging way of life. And that can only be done through, I guess, international cooperation. And one of the ways in which I hope the world is slowly moving towards is this concept of payment for ecosystem services. Because everybody in the world benefits from the ecosystems, and the one that I'm most involved with is tropical forests. It could equally be talking about coral reefs or grasslands or other mangroves, other ecosystems. Each has their range of services that they provide to the environment in which we live. So they're not doing it for us, but we benefit from it. And the example I use, because there's an animated weather map that shows the movement of rainfall around the world, and it seems to be driven by the rainfall systems that build up over the 3 tropical forest blocks of Amazonia and the Congo-Guinean forests in Africa and the South and Southeast Asian forests. And tropical forests not only receive rain, I mean, they're called rainforests because it rains, but they also put huge quantities of water vapor into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. So transpiration of water through the roots up the plant, out through the leaves, and evaporation off the leaves is there's a column of water vapor rising above forests. And some of it falls back down into the forest, but part of it moves on and ends up watering the rest of the world. Of course, a lot of water is also evaporated from the oceans. We know that. But my colleagues in Oxford at the Forest Canopy Programme calculate that the amount of water vapor per unit area, per square mile or square kilometre in a rainforest is 8 to 10 times more than that in the sea. And that produces an effect which some have described as being like a biotic pump. And it is generating weather patterns, which you can then track around the world. At the moment, if you buy bread from wheat grown in Europe or in North America or in Australia, not a penny of your loaf of bread, or if you like a glass of wine, if you drink wine from California or South Africa or New Zealand or Spain, not a penny of your purchase price goes to protect the rainforests that can be visibly demonstrated to be involved in the weather systems that water the vineyards or the cornfields. And that's why I think we have to restructure our economy so that we actually pay something. When we buy a product, some of that money is channeled back to protect the ecosystems that are involved in its production and at the same time in keeping our climate stable. You know, we talk about the importance of forests because they sequester and store carbon. They take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen and store the carbon. And that's a service that we all depend on because we all need oxygen to breathe, just as we all need fresh water to drink, and we all like food to eat. So all the things that we regard as essentials in life can actually be traced to at least partly the role of a tropical forest. And yet it is not a priority of any government spending to protect those forests. In fact, on the contrary, governments have been subsidizing the destruction of the forests because they see it as a wilderness area that's of no value until it's got houses or fields or plantations or mines in them. And we have to somehow change that. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that our leaders that don't have any knowledge of ecology and an understanding of the way the world actually works, if they did politics and economics at university, they've learned about the human stuff as if that's separate from nature. And we have to train our leaders in a basic knowledge of ecology so that when they take a decision, they are aware of the consequences of that decision. And we haven't done very well in that. regard. So those of you with ecological knowledge, please share it with your elected representatives. Be patient with them. They might not have the same perspective as you, but once they get it, once they understand that it's in their interest and our interests, then it will become part of their thinking. No, we can't put a road through there because that's an elephant migratory pathway. We can't put a plantation there because elephants or primates are feeding there. We will just be creating human-wildlife conflict. And if that's part of the land use planning, that's a good phrase that doesn't come up in most conversations, but land use planning is what we have to inform. And very often it doesn't get planned. Land use just happens because somebody thinks, if nobody stops me, I can build a house here, I can put a plantation here. And when someone stops you, you just say, well, what do I need to do to convince that person not to stop me? Is it hand over some money? Is it find a job for his relative? Is it, that's a very human thing to do. You want to solve a problem by helping the person who's obstructing you to think differently. Well, we have to do that in a more clever way. As ecologists, we have to convince the people that actually they and their children are going to be better off if they take decisions including an ecological awareness and the knowledge of animal behavior and the ecosystem services. And those are all phrases which are so alien to most people. When was the last time you sat down with a friend and had a chat about payment for ecosystem services? It doesn't happen. But somehow we have to introduce the concept into the people who are taking the decisions, whether it's their daily shop, whether they buy the product that's come from a certified source that isn't destroying ecosystems, or a product that is just cheap and cheerful, but is actually the bigger price that you're not paying is the destruction of some important ecosystem. So individuals who are not in positions of power, every day they wield their personal power through their purse or their pocket. And every time they vote, they wield their political power. Because if you haven't asked your political leader what his or her opinion is on an ecological question, how do you know if they're representing your view? And our personal power, just in terms of volunteering for organizations, getting involved with organizations like the Living Earth. What a great way to engage people. So yeah, we're all powerful in our way. Our pocket, our purse, our political power, who we vote for, and our personal power, what we do every day. We must make the world a better place. There we go. That's a good out for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for this wonderful section. And now we know why you are the ambassador for Convention of Migratory Species. And thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Sure.
In due course, especially if we can get the Living Earth elephant sanctuary off the ground.
Sure.
Yeah, hopefully we will be able to work on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
And thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye, sir.